Hi, I'm Bill, and welcome to the Theater of Memory. As you know, the Theater of Memory much prefers to be in the room with you so that you can see the documents up close and handle the artifacts in your own hands. This is not possible at this time, and so we've decided to try to take this to you in a more appropriate way so that we can social distance, and that way is through the miracle of video. And it's not going to feel like a miracle to me as I'm trying to remember everything I'm supposed to do, but that's okay because you guys are worth it. So here we go. The issue and the edition is The Forgotten Famous. And so we get to show you some people who were in their time huge. I mean huge. And now they are completely forgotten. So this may seem like the long way around, but let me tell you this. The Library of Southern Literature says, it has often been debated as to whether the Pilgrim Mothers or the Pilgrim Fathers were the greatest martyrs. And obviously it's true that it must have been the Pilgrim Mothers, because not only did they endure the deprivations, the same ones that the Pilgrim Fathers did, but they had to endure the Pilgrim Fathers as well. It's from the Library of Southern Literature, and it's almost correct. I mean, it's a very clever thing, and it's funny, and they just made the little mistake of getting the Pilgrims confused with the Puritans. Pilgrims are fairly laid-back people for that time, but the Puritans, not so much. And so the reason I'm telling you this is because I was raised Congregationalist, which was the Puritans' legacy to churches in New England. But I grew up in a wonderful church. They were lovely people. And the reason is because Henry Ward Beecher was, in the 19th century, a preacher who believed in the gospel of Christ's love. So it went from fire and brimstone to the love of Christ in a very short time because of this man, whom some called the most famous man in America, and among those was the New York Times. So let me just read you a little bit from his book here. And this book is Life Thoughts. Life Thoughts. Cue the music. And kidding, no music. And the thing was, he wrote a bunch of books, and some of them were very sweet, and some, but here, just on the same page, God puts the excess of hope in one man in order that it may be medicine to the man who is despondent. Nice. Over here it says, when flowers are full of heaven-descended dews, they always hang their heads. But men hold theirs the higher, the more they receive, getting proud as they get full. And so was the situation with Henry Ward Beecher. Let me show you what I mean. Well then, there he is, the great man. He is younger here and on his way to becoming the most famous man in America. But Reverend Beecher was poised to become an absolute superstar, and it was by preaching the gospel of love. However, like those flowers in his little aphorism, they fill with dew from heaven and they bend over, except man, it gets filled from heaven and they stand up straighter and are proud. And I think pride was a problem with the Reverend. I will say that because he became friends, of course, with the big people in New York, some of whom were the railroad magnates. And so when the strike came, where the railroad workers had their wages cut, their pittance was cut by the tycoons, they went out on strike, and Reverend Beecher preached against them. He preached strongly against the workers and said, "Man who cannot live by bread alone, but the man who cannot live on bread and water is not fit to live." And he also said, "If you are being reduced, go down boldly into poverty." What? Hard to understand, but I do know that around this time, here is how he was pictured, and he is obviously Gulliver there, and his people below are Lilliputians compared to the big great man. And at this time he was, as famous as a man could be in the United States of America. He was the most famous. He was not only a leader in women's suffrage, the movement appealed to him because he loved women. He really loved women, and that is probably evidenced by the fact that the rumors of his continuing adultery with members of his flock never went away. But he was also the leader, or a leader, of the temperance movement. And the teetotalers loved him because he was on their side and helped preach abstinence. And so the temperance movement had him as one of their poster children. And I will show you this, although I have just found out that just like a mirror, a selfie turns things backwards. So I'll have to read it to you anyway, which I would have done even if we had been in the same room together, except I just would have handed it to you after that, and you would have discovered the mistakes in my transliteration. So, Brooklyn, New York, 124 Columbia Heights, May 2nd, 1884. The Rhine wine, which I thought had not been delivered, was probably sent to Perkinside and received when I was absent. I sent a check for the amount, and it will be rendered if I find that there is wine at Perkins. I'll notify you, otherwise everything's all right. So, there he is, leader of the temperance movement, having wine delivered to his house. Isn't that interesting? Well, let's find somebody who is a little more upright. Somebody who is also a story of success, but this success starts out when she is, I think, under 2 and gets scarlet fever and survives it, but she is without sight and without hearing. She can taste a little, she can smell a little, but touch is what she has. And this happens to be at a time when a great man named Samuel Howe was just coming back from the Greek Revolution, where he fought with Lord Byron, who expired at that time. Mr. Howe made it back, married Julia Ward Howe, who was later to write the Battle Hymn of the Republic, and he opened a school for blind and deaf children in Boston. And he took on this child who had been figuring out the world on her own at the farm where her family lived for some years. I think she was probably 7 when she came to him. So 5 years on her own, locked into the silence and the darkness. And he came to her, and she began to learn the hand alphabet, what they called finger speaking. And there was a breakthrough moment, just exactly like Anne Bancroft and Patty Duke in the Miracle Worker, where Helen Keller is brought into the world by Annie Sullivan. So, turns out, I'm getting ahead of myself, but Laura Bridgman was the one who taught Annie Sullivan finger talk. but that was later when she was teaching. Now she is a child who has come into the area and come into Boston, and they are working. She is studying. She can spell things out. She asks questions, I'm told, made people a little crazy by her absolute curiosity about everything, you know. Somebody wrote down some questions one day. Why do flies not have names like boys and girls do? Is the worm afraid when the hen eats them? Why do cows have two horns? To push two cows? Why can't we sail in the sun in boats? If I eat fish hooks, would I be dead? Okay, so as she gets older, this is her as she's older. But her younger pictures, as in the one on her book here, have her with this little eye thing on. And in fact, there's probably a better picture of her in here when she's young. I believe there is. Here's one of her with Dr. Howe. And she is wearing a green ribbon over her eyes, as did every child in the school there. And we have some details about her. I mean, she was the most famous person. Laura's autograph, of which we have one, was in demand by 1840. She was the most famous person in America. Only Victoria, the Queen, was better known. And Dickens devoted a chapter, which I would hand to you, but I can't, so I will go ahead and read a little excerpt from it, which is Charles Dickens' American Notes for General Circulation. It is strange to watch the faces of the blind and see how free they all are from concealment of what is passing in their thoughts, observing which a man with eyes may blush to contemplate the mask he wears, allowing for one shade of anxious expression which is never absent from their countenances, and the like of which we may readily detect in our own faces if we try to feel our way in the dark. Every idea, as it rises within, is expressed with the lightning speed and nature's truth. If the company at a rout or drawing room at court could only for one time be unconscious of the eyes upon them, as blind men and women are, what secrets would come out, and what a worker of hypocrisy this sight, the loss of which we so much pity, would appear to be. This thought occurred to me as I sat down in another room before a girl, blind, deaf, and dumb, destitute of smell and nearly so of taste, before a fair young creature with every human faculty and hope and power of goodness and affection enclosed within her delicate frame, and but one outward sense, the sense of touch. There she was before me, built up, as it were, in a marble cell, impervious to any ray of light or particle of sound, with her poor white hand peeping through a chink in the wall, beckoning to some good man for help, that an immortal soul might be awakened. And the hand is coming through the chink like that. As I said, she later taught Annie Sullivan fingerspeak, who taught Helen Keller. It was funny because Helen Keller's mother read this piece by Charles Dickens and realized that there was hope for her daughter. So she got in touch, and Annie Sullivan, the woman who had been taught fingerspeak by Laura Bridgman, came and was her teacher and released her from the darkness and the silence, and she became a great woman and somewhat of a poet. She said, "They took my eyes, but Milton's Paradise soothed my sighs." Nope. got it. They took my eyes, but I remembered Milton's Paradise. They took my ears, but Beethoven came and soothed my tears. They took all this, but they could not take my soul, and possessing that, I still possess the whole. Is that cool or what? I almost remembered it. And the reason that I'm so excited is that I get to show you this. Now, I paid $85 for this when that was a lot of money. You know, I was living out in the woods in a Seminole chickadee barn, and this catalog came to me and said I could have this for $85. And I jumped at it, and I have never regretted. No buyer's remorse at all. I was glad. Any food or gasoline that I had at that time is long gone. This is still here. And it says, this is what she came out of darkness and silence to report on this autograph. God is love and truth. Laura Bridgman, March 16th, 1876. And I can tell you that her handwriting is better than mine. So anyway, superior person, so very interesting, and somebody who not only made herself a household name just by being who she was, but also was instrumental in bringing Helen Keller and so many others out of the dark. Okay, and the next chapter starts with something from The Music Man. And it goes like this. Not a wholesome trotting race, no, but a race where they sit down and ride on the horse. Like to see some stuck-up jockey boy sitting on Dan Patch. Make your blood boil, well, I should say. Dan Patch. Dan Patch was a horse. The horse in this picture, which is, of course, a glossy. You can see it. It's hard to keep the gloss away. That's Dan Patch. No, it's not. That's a movie about Dan Patch from 46. I think it's probably, 30 years after he had reached his prime and been the most famous in America. And let me read this to you. One of his biographers says, 100 years ago, the most famous athlete in America was a horse. But Dan Patch was more than a sports star. He was a cultural icon in the days before the automobile. Born crippled and unable to stand, he was nearly euthanized. For a while, he pulled the grocer's wagon in his hometown of Oxford, Indiana. But when he was entered in a race at the county fair, he won. And he kept on winning. Harness racing was the top sport in America at the time, and Dan, a pacer, set the world record for the mile. He eventually lowered the mark by 4 seconds, an unheard of achievement that would not be surpassed for decades. Ooh, okay, so this guy was so cool, and the horse is the guy I'm talking about. This horse was so cool that he would finish the race and he would stop of his own accord and come back around, waiting for the sound, looking up at the crowd. And when the judges made their decision, the crowd would roar and he would kind of bow like that and leave. He loved the crowds. And he was so famous they would take him into like big hotels, and he would come in there and adoring people would come up, and sometimes somebody would be crass enough to pull his tail to try to get a hair, and he would whip around. He did not kick. Any other horse would have hurt somebody, but he did not. But he looked around with such a look of scorn, they would back off saying, I'm sorry. Anyway, that makes him cool. But what's fun, and he became the poster child. I'm using that term a lot, but it's true. He became this. He became the guy. This was him. he became the guy. Dan Patch, it says right there, backwards, but I'm seeing it. Maybe it won't turn out backwards. I don't know. But 155 apparently is his test there, his time. But Dan Patch was so loved, so adored, but he held a place in the culture that made it very interesting because, oh, here's Dan Patch plug, cut plug. I mean, there were Dan Patch wagons, Dan Patch this, Dan Patch washers, Dan Patch everythings. But anyway, oh no, here it is. Okay, no, we're fine. Okay. The standardbred had a practical application. He was a standardbred. He was not a thoroughbred. The thoroughbreds were the playthings of rich people. The standardbreds were not. But get this. Standardbred had a practical application. He was something more than what the thoroughbred had become. More, that is, than merely a bettor's plaything. He was along with the incandescent light bulb, the slot machine, the gramophone, the typewriter, and other wonders of the age, a life-changing American invention. A loose network of equinophiles, equinophiles, in the eastern United States had set out circa 1835 to produce the great American driving horse. And within 3 decades, they had, to their own amazement, succeeded brilliantly, compounding the standardbred, a completely new breed out of equal parts thoroughbred, bloodstock, common farm nags, and dumb luck. Some of these horses trotted naturally at a relatively high speed. Others preferred to pace. Trotting is right foreleg, left hind leg, right, the left foreleg, right hind leg, like that. But pacing is parallel. Right side, left side, right side, left side. But these guys were trotters. Okay. Some of these horses trotted naturally at relatively high speed. Others preferred to pace. But they were in either case, a perfect fit for the changing times when a network of well-engineered roads began snaking across America. And our great-great-grandfathers got more sophisticated and citified, climbing out of the saddle and into the driver's seat. The world suddenly was a world on wheels. And it was the standardbred, of whom the star was Dan Patch. He was the, I don't want to say poster child, so shall I say he was the golden boy of the standard breed, and he was a celebrity beyond the understanding of almost anybody in a time when sports were not a big deal. Dan Patch was a big deal. About the time of the Civil War, I know that because Matthew Brady took this photograph, there was this family of Lilliputians. They were, kind of circus people. They were the novelty act of the age. And on the back, it actually has all their signatures here too, which will also, I think, be backwards. But all of them have signed, and it says compliments of Charles S. Stroughton and compliments of Lavinia Warren Stratton, and then G.W. Worcester and Minnie Warren. All of these people had Matthew Brady take their photograph because they were superstars at the time, and they were universally loved, and we know nothing of them at all now. They were eclipsed by General Tom Thumb of Barnum, the Barnum era, and so he put these guys kind of into obscurity, but they were, at the time of the Civil War, which some people call the war between the states, or the War of Northern Aggression. It depends on who you talk to. This was a super act in the world. And next time I will get out my Dan Rice stuff, because Dan Rice was the biggest entertainment figure at that time. But I'm still waiting for something in the mail that I could show you. And again, I wish I could hand these to you, and I would be delighted to do that sometime. But right now, it's impossible. We will get together again. I hope you can see this signature and thumbprint. This is Two Guns White Calf, who was a very important man. Now, he was a chief of the Piikani Blackfoot. And you know him. I know you know him, not by name, but you will recognize his visage right here as it appears on the nickel. So anyway, he is one of the emblematic of the people who were representing the Native American at a time when they were still very much alive. They're alive now, but you know, this was just after the beginning of the 20th century. And this letter here has him writing from Glacier National Park, which is the old Piikani Blackfoot territory that has now become a part of the United States of America, but it means it's being saved and not a lot of things are happening commercially there. And so I guess he's okay in aligning himself with this. He is born in 1871, named John Two Guns, and he was adopted at an early age by White Calf, a chief of the Piikani Blackfoot, and who was also the son of White Calf, who was another chief of the Blackfoot, and he went to Washington, this is the grandfather, to demand that the United States pay them what they said they were going to pay them for their land, and died mysteriously in the president's office. I guess he must have made a forceful argument. And then his father, White Calf, went to Washington, and he went in and talked to the Department of the Interior. The Department of the Interior said, yeah, you go home, we'll send you the check. And he said, no, I will live in the streets in a blanket and eat garbage before I'll leave without that money. And so they gave him the money and he went home. Well, this man raised Two Guns. Two Guns White Calf became his name. Actually, he was called John White Calf Two Guns, John Two Guns, John, until the railroad, who sponsored him in their effort to get tourists to Glacier National Park, settled on Two Guns White Calf. And that's his signature there. It's a famous signature. But this letter from Glacier National Park, March 15th, 1928, says, Oki, which means I am your friend. Oki, it has made me happy to receive your letter asking for information regarding the homeland of my people, Glacier National Park. I am asking the Great Northern Railway to send you their illustrated literature describing Glacier National Park and its many and varied attractions. This great international playground, which now includes the Waterton Lakes region of these Canadian Rockies, known as Waterton Lakes National Park, where the new Prince of Wales Hotel is located, has been the summer playground of the Blackfeet Indians for many, many years. In appreciation of your inquiry, I am also sending you a reproduction of my original photograph with my autograph. Compare it with the head on the buffalo nickel. And so this is what he sent. And this isn't the original one that he sent, which of course would be quite valuable now, and it wasn't with the letter, but this is he. And that is the carte de visite that he would send. And James Earl Fraser was the sculptor who did this, the nickel, and over the years, he said, "Oh, well, there was another person who was a model too, and it's kind of an amalgam." And then he said there were three, and then he said he'd never met Two Guns White Calf at all. The reason being is that the government was afraid he was becoming too famous, and having had problems with his father and grandfather in them standing up for their rights and the rights of their tribe. They were chiefs, after all. They decided that they would go ahead and say, well, that's not him at all. But it was him. I'm fascinated to think, too, that during his life, the hobo nickel came to be, where people would take a nickel. Hobos, and mind you, hobos are not bums. Hobos are people temporarily out of work, maybe on the move, looking for some work. So this is something that we kind of don't recognize now, but that was an honorable thing to do at a time. And these hobos had very little money, and they could take an Indian head nickel, a buffalo nickel, and they could make it so that it was worth more with a very simple tool of just a nail or, something a little more elaborate. And they became known as hobo nickels. These are visages that are carved on these nickels to make them worth a little more. Maybe it would get them a whole meal, maybe a place to stay. But the nickels that were called hobo nickels were done between, mostly during the Depression. So after 29 and up until 35, when the hobo nickel was, I think, phased out. The funny thing is now, any time a coin is altered, it is called a hobo nickel, whether it's a silver dollar or a half dollar or a dime or, a Lincoln penny. And there are people who are doing this to this day for the ability to sell and make a little money. And so you can look on eBay and find hobo nickels. But these might well have been from that time, because I purchased them from a coin dealer rather than an artist on eBay. They look to have been done, if not by the same hand, in a similar style, and I think they're a lot of fun. What's fun, and still a little out of my reach, is the $50 Liberty Potty. And it's Liberty standing on a chamber, or sitting on a chamber pot. She was seated, and it didn't take too much to make her sit on a chamber pot. So that one is just a little bit beyond my reach right now, but I'd be happy to show it to you if I get it, and I'd love for you to hold these in your hand and see them up close. Well, this is Evelyn Nesbit. Talk about forgotten famous. She was once the it girl. In fact, she was the only it girl, because there had never been an it girl until it happened to her. She was young. She had been raised in Pittsburgh. Her father had died. They had been very close, and he had shared his books with her, so she was quite literate and absolutely lovely. And so she became a model. First a little bit in Pittsburgh, but then her mother, who was hard pressed to keep a job or even work as a seamstress, went to New York, took her children, and Evelyn became a famous model there. I will say that if you want, you can always, and I would like to say that in that room over there with you guys, I mentioned Evelyn Nesbit when I think it was Ben said, oh, the girl in the red velvet swing. And I said, what? And that began my education about Evelyn Nesbit. She was the girl in the red velvet swing, and later played by Joan Collins, but in real life she was a gorgeous child, because she started modeling at 14 14, 15, 16. She was very young, and she was compromised. I'm trying to think of a polite word for deflowered, by the architect Stanford White, who had impeccable taste. He furnished J.P. Morgan's house. You can see it at the J.P. Morgan Library. He was the big architect in New York. And he got her drunk and had his way with her one night after he had been pushing her in this red velvet swing. And she was his child, she said. She found delight, but she said that he was kind of a benevolent vampire. The reason I know that is because I did see Evelyn Nesbit and Stanford White and Love and Death in the Gilded Age by Michael McDonald Mooney, and it's a good one. And I loved American Eve, which is Evelyn Nesbit, Stanford White, The Birth of the It Girl, and the game Crime of the Century. And it was also called The Trial of the Century, because Harry K. Thaw, a rich Pittsburgh ne'er-do-well heir, fell in love with her, pursued her, and ended up going up to Madison Square Garden one night and shooting Stanford White point blank in the head. And it was a crime beyond anybody's imagination, right there in public. And so he went to trial and said, that he loved this woman and had married her, and he was just protecting the world from somebody like Stanford White. But, I've also read this one, Tragic Beauty, which is the lost 1914 memoirs of Evelyn Nesbit, and I am willing to bet you, from getting to know her in here, that Deborah Dorian Paul, the editor, was the one who said Tragic Beauty. I don't think that she was like that at all. She was, in fact, she even says in it that, are you going to rail at fate? What has happened has happened. Deal with it. You've been on the path, and this is where you happen to be. Make the best of it. And she's wonderfully articulate in that. But what I want to tell you is not just that she's gorgeous, and she sits for everybody, including Charles Dana Gibson. Charles Dana Gibson, who loves to draw her, and she becomes the Gibson girl. Not a Gibson girl, the Gibson girl. You remember if you ever saw the movie Girl in the Red Velvet Swing, there's a nice scene between Gibson and Evelyn here on the shore when she's talking to him and he's trying to give her advice, and she's just a kid still. And this one is called Of Course There Are Mermaids. It's a famous one, and I think, I haven't checked, but it's in one of the books that I have, and the library at the Theater of Memory has a pretty good collection of Charles Dana Gibson books. But what I want to tell you is that after this, her life, I want to say, went to hell for a few years, and she was miserable, as we say in French. Here's a thing of her from a magazine, but what I want to read is, Stanny White was killed, Nesbit said, after her husband, Mad Harry Thaw, shot the architect at Madison Square Garden, which he had designed. That's Stanford White had designed it. But my face was worse, she said. I lived. So, yeah. So, here's something that's fun. To me, it might not be to you, but I was able to, through looking through thousands of things about Evelyn Nesbit, I found this. And it is a picture of her, and you can see down here, it starts with an F. And so nobody stopped to think that it would be Frances Evelyn Nesbit, but I did. I knew. And so one of the very few autographs has come into the keeping here at the Theater of Memory, and it's '06, and it's kind of pensive. It is after it has happened, and her life is miserable. I mean, it's a huge thing throughout the world, and especially in New York and the United States. And Harry Thaw's mother has been using her considerable wealth to try to tip things in his way so that he won't be hung, or whatever they were doing, people at the time. And so there are even campaigns that look like this, music, for the sake of wife and home. This is, something suggested by the Thaw White tragedy. Clinically, today we would say that Harry Thaw was crazy, and I don't think anybody would disagree with that. But she went on his behalf and testified, and he got off. Even though she realized how crazy he was, because when they had gone to Europe, they had gone to I think a Scottish castle. He dismissed the staff and then stripped her and beat her. And nobody really believed that, I think. And so after the trial, she was destitute. Suddenly the family cut her off, even though she had been the salvation of Harry K. Thaw. And she, started doing, this started working in vaudeville and in the shows. Do a little of this, do a little of that. And that's her picture there, Evelyn Nesbit. And here is Sprinkle Me with Kisses If You Want My Love to Grow. Here she is. She's the one. And she's doing this, and she's got a dance act, and she's going all around, but just to try to keep her child fed. And that is Culver Pictures, Inc. It's Evelyn Nesbit. This picture is loaned for one reproduction only, must not be used for advertising without written permission. Original must be returned within 30 days. Well, apparently it wasn't. But there she is with her son, and she fights viciously to keep that son from going to the Thaws, because she knows that the clinical report came back and he was crazy. So anyway, she's having a heck of a time, but she is still a friend of Gibson. Charles Dana Gibson is still a friend and confidant. So Charles Dana Gibson goes to upstate New York at some point. He has a friend up there who is also an artist. She asks him to draw Evelyn Nesbit, the original Gibson girl. And I have that drawing right here. So lucky that that came into my keeping. But look at her, how different she is now. She looks quite careworn. So this was a friend creating an image of somebody who he loved, but had fallen onto hard times. And I will say this, things changed a lot for Evelyn and her credibility when this headline came out. And it says, I can't read it backwards. It says, Thaw in new felony, boy naked whipped. So, oh yeah, well, maybe she was right, okay? So, it's just more stuff, white slavery, and all that, all the news that's fit, So she also lived long enough to meet Joan Collins and okay the script for her biopic, The Girl in the Red Velvet Swing. So, turned out okay for her. She did pretty well. I'm going to get a drink. Here's to you. Wish I could be in the same room. These things are much better in person, as you know, and it's the Theater of Memory's policy to put them in your hands. Can't do that right now. Okay, here's something. If I say Cyrus W. Field, what do you think of? Well, some people will actually think of the fact that he was the one who did the first transatlantic cable. I've always been interested in him. I have his autograph someplace. Here it is. Nice, huh? He had kind of retired in his 30s, and they came to him and said, we're going to try to do this. We're going to try to put a telegraph cable across the Atlantic Ocean. And he kind of bought into it. He called a guy who was the Pathfinder of the Seas. He's still called the Pathfinder of the Seas, Matthew Fontaine Maury. Now, you probably haven't heard his name either. Matthew Fontaine Maury was, along with Jefferson Davis, one of the two people whom the North, the Union, never pardoned, never granted amnesty after the war between the states. And the reason was that both of those guys broke their heart. The most able scientist of the day was a young officer in the U.S. Navy who could be seen even when it was stormy out there with his arm around the mast reading one of his books. He was a nerd, but a brilliant guy until a stagecoach accident made him too lame to go to sea duty anymore. So they put him at the Naval Observatory in Washington, D.C. and said, you're in charge now. And what he did was he found all the old logs that had been stored for all these years from all the naval ships, and he plotted data points of where the current was going this way and where it was going that way. And so he mapped the currents of the Atlantic Ocean. He discovered the Gulf Stream. Nobody knew until that point. And for the first time in 5,000 years, knowing the winds and the currents, shipping ran on time. This guy was huge. So anyway, Cyrus W. Field wants to put this thread across the ocean. This is even the name of a book here, Thread Across the Ocean, you know. And so he calls Matthew Fontaine Maury and says, do you think this can be done? Matthew Fontaine Maury shows up at his house, comes into the parlor and puts down a report and says, I did the work on this 10 years ago. I've always wondered if it could be done. And so the two men talked about it, and Field went ahead and raised the money. The first time they tried it, they had trouble. They realized that they needed steam power. You could not depend on wind and waves to get you where you wanted to go with these big drums of cable. And so I am so pleased that I have a piece of that cable. There it is. And you can see it's not much, but this says on it, Tiffany & Company in New York City. And the reason it says that is explained in this letter, which is a facsimile. This is the real signature. This is a facsimile. But the signature's right. New York, August 21st, 1858. This is right after it was done. This is to certify that I have sold the balance of the Atlantic Telegraph cable now on board the MSS Niagara to Messrs. Tiffany and Company, jewelers, number 550 Broadway of this city, and that the piece which accompanies this is a genuine section thereof. So again, I wish I could hand this to you because it is so unbelievably cool. This is, something that for the first time made it possible to talk back and forth between continents, not 3 weeks or 6 weeks for the mail, but instantaneously at the phenomenal rate of 12 words a minute. It was definitely something huge. And when it happened, I'm telling you, there were, things done all over the world. He was wined and dined, feted, I don't know, all over the world. He's just such a big deal. And all of Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper here and Harper's Weekly here. Look at there, the angels down there walking along the cable under the thing. And they, thanks to Matthew Fontaine Moore, who had also had soundings done, when they throw over a weight, figure out how deep it's gone, and look to see on the thing just how much is played out, and then they know what the depth is. When it hits bottom, it stops going. And so they now have a machine that kind of shoots it out like a cannon, and so he took advantage of this, Matthew Fontaine Moore, head of the Naval Observatory, and created a map of the sea floor. And now the cable goes the safest way in what is known as the telegraph plateau, because there is a plateau under the ocean, and it's the best way to go so that you're not doing this all the time. But get this, the cable would break. They would keep seeing if they could send messages on it, and as they're rolling it out, and it would break. And the first time it was a bust, and the second time they got this ship called the Great Eastern and redid it so that it had all those spools. This is 1,800 miles. First, from Nova Scotia to Newfoundland, then from Newfoundland to Ireland. So they get this ship and they go out there and they get almost over there and it's gone. It breaks and they can't get it back. They have a 5-fingered claw looking like an anchor, something you would drag, and they almost get it back up, and they lose it and they give up and they go home. But there is such a willingness and an enthusiasm. Now, the first time they get it done and it works for a little while, and the Queen talks to the President, and stories come from Crimea or whatever, and all this stuff gets across, and then it fails. Hoax! Hoax! It's all a big hoax! It's always never been nothing but a hoax! Or so cried the social media at the time, which of course meant newspapers, magazines, and the loud guy at the end of the bar in the pub. But it wasn't a hoax. It had been done, and then it was done again. It took perseverance, and it took years. But in 1865, they got out there, and they completed it. And then on that ship, they went back to where they had lost the previous cable and grappled for it again with mechanical, not hands, mechanical grappled. They grappled for it, and they pulled it up, and it was still working. So they spliced it in, took it to shore, and now there were 2 transatlantic cables carrying 2,400 words a day at $1.25 a word. So it worked out okay for them. So the impossible was not just possible, it was doubly possible. So there you go. What have we learned today? Well, how about that there were two waves of early immigrants from England to New England, the Pilgrims and the Puritans. Reverend Beecher went from the love of Christ to social Darwinism in that much time. Laura Bridgman touched the world in a literal as well as a figurative sense, because that was her only organ of sense, was her sense of touch, and she made it work, and she turned out to be a brilliant soul once released from the darkness and the silence. Little people love bigly. Dan Patch was the first American sports superstar, pulling in $1 million a year when Ty Cobb was pulling in $12,000 a year. You know, I had this sense that I may be making all of this up. And you're not in the room to say, whoa, well, wait a second. But I think I've gotten it mostly right. If I haven't, I have always enjoyed our discourse. And for you to get in touch with me, it would be memorycurator@gmail.com. That's memorycurator, one word, @gmail.com. And I would love to hear from you. It is frustrating not being in the same room because it is the intellectual give and take that I enjoy so much. And I look forward to when I can be able to be in your august presence and hand things to you and say, what do you think about this? Because you always have something that you think about it. Meanwhile, thanks so much. And the Theater of Memory is always open to you. Go ahead and give me an email. Shoot me an email, as the children say. And I'd always love to hear from you. Meanwhile, peace out. Stay safe. Bye-bye.